Good morning. Welcome to the Seraph
Good morning,
webinar.
everyone. We're now live. It seems we're just having a few people come in on LinkedIn, and we'll let that happen for just another minute. But
Wonderful.
okay,
Hope
we're good to
everyone,
go. We'll
hope
start.
everyone's had a great week. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are in the world. We've been running these regular tariff updates. I'm in Washington, D.C. this week. My trip here got extended a little bit. Finding a lot of activity going on right now. There's a big push for harmonized tariff schedule getting updated. There's a big push to figure out where allies fall in with trade, and a huge push for trade, not aid. So everyone seems to have refocused on trade within the administration. This is a business environment, and the streets of Washington are much quieter. I'm seeing far fewer lobbyists around. It's a different world than it was during the last administration. Everyone seems to be focused on tariffs. So we've got a lot to talk about today. We're going to do a short update now, and we'll see what comes out. Notable things that happened this week was the 25% tariff that Trump talked about on cars, pharmaceuticals, and semiconductors. There's a lot going on, and there's a lot of behind-the-scenes work. Last week, we talked about how the harmonized tariff schedule needed to be updated to enable the tariffs that are on pause to come in play potentially on 12:01 a.m. March 4th. That's less than 2 weeks away. So we've got a lot of moving pieces right now and a lot going on. So let's jump into some data that we've pulled together and have a good discussion here. We'll look forward to talking more.
And if you've got questions and you're following along on LinkedIn, please use the comment function, which will allow us to just go through these questions at the end of this brief presentation. And if you're on YouTube, we have comments there as well. So in case you're new to following this, and we've been tracking a few different tariffs that Trump has announced, actually even before he took office. But now that he's taken office, the Chinese tariff is in place, 10% on all goods. And then he has paused due to border security negotiations and some concessions from the Canada and Mexico alongside his border security agenda. But those are 25% tariffs that haven't been canceled yet. They've just been paused as we wait for more progress there.
And
Ambrose?
here in DC, there's been a real focus on border security. So we're in the Munich Security Conference, there was a clear message to the Europeans that they need to step up to defend themselves. There is a refocusing going on towards Asia, but also towards the northern and southern border within the United States. So I expect that will continue. That's not necessarily a trade or a tariff thing, but as we see the world order start to shift and change, we need to watch that fairly closely. So I believe that the pause is simply that, a pause for Canada and Mexico. There's now a measure that an exit criteria. We all know exit criteria fairly well. There's an exit criteria that's been put in place, and we need to see movement with security along those borders. Now, there are some steps that are going on. The question is, will it be enough to prevent these tariffs from going live as scheduled at 12:01 a.m. on March 4th? And that's with Canada and Mexico. The 25% tariff on aluminum and steel, March 12th, that's set for China. We're seeing that additional 10%. And there was discussion by Trump yesterday. He was asked on Air Force One if there was potential for a deal with China. And his answer was, of course, there's potential for a deal. But I think the deal has to be a lot sweeter than the last deal was that was abandoned by China. So China is going to have to give a lot in order to avoid a trade war. That's my interpretation from lots of discussions over the course of this week. It's been an interesting time here in DC. And as we talked about before, there are some no regrets moves we can do. We can look at localizing things. We can look at safety critical items. We can look at labor intensive items, which are really hard to move. And we just need to understand what the break even point is for those kind of things. But a lot moving in the tariff world. And I think we're going to continue to see this. Key for me, though, out of all of this is harmonization, because we can't have one country being tariffed at a far different rate than another.
Yeah, and I think that's the messaging that is coming out. So when the reciprocal tariff plan was announced last week, it wasn't so much as an executive order, but a clarification and a little bit more information for all of us about what was going to be coming in the report delivered by the Secretary of Commerce and others to Trump on April 1st as
Mm-hmm.
part of Trump's announced America First trade policy. And so we've already kind of discussed on the left-hand side here about what tariffs are scheduled to come, but the reciprocal tariffs was pretty surprising about how broad Trump was considering what a tariff is. So he's really considering any sort of barrier to trade. Now, it'll be up to his team with Commerce and Treasury and trade representative to figure out exactly what that means, and that's what we'll be hearing in about a month and a half. But in Trump's initial announcement, he mentioned things like a value-added tax that could be reciprocated in some way. He didn't spell out exactly how that would happen. Non-monetary trade barriers, so maybe restrictions on certain types of U.S. agricultural products because how they're grown, things like that. That might be part of a his tariff plan, and subsidies and penalties. So if a industry is heavily subsidized, he may look to use a tariff to uh, hold that back, or as he's talked about in Europe, especially penalties on tech companies, fines for data privacy and other things like that. He's viewing that as a restriction on American trade, and those are all much broader than when we first hear the word reciprocal tariffs. So that's what we're going to be looking for on April 1st. And he, in a discussion with Lutnick, who was his Secretary of Commerce nominee, but who was just confirmed yesterday, they said that those would likely roll out over time, but the first ones will hit on April 2nd. This is discussion. It's not a promise, not an executive order. Just that was when they were unveiling the reciprocal tariff last week.
So it's not going to be a joke on April 1st, on April Fool's Day, when those tariffs come out. Unfortunately, it's going to be very real, and we all have been warned, and we are prepared to understand that there are going to be changes. Justin, I'm going to deviate here a little bit. The strategy for this administration is something else that I've talked a lot about with people here, and it really does seem to be a reindustrialization of the United States. I think as we look at the disparity, service revenues, other things, we need to reindustrialize the United States of America. Yeah, I'm a student of history, and it feels very much like we're in the late 1930s right now, where there is a focus on rebuilding our industrial base, getting America ready to go, bringing in and securing critical minerals. We've heard Trump talk about Greenland. We've heard him ask for critical minerals in Ukraine. There is a big push to get critical minerals. China moved and took a significant license of critical minerals from the Cook Islands earlier this week. So there's a lot going on, and Trump is trying to move and play catch up very quickly now to secure the critical minerals our industry in the West needs to move forward. And he's trying to lead for the West, not just the United States, but being hampered, it seems, or what I'm hearing is that there's a feeling that allies are not necessarily moving in lockstep and moving as quickly as President Trump wants to move. So we'll watch that very closely, but the focus of reindustrializing the United States, manufacturing not in the North American region, but in the United States, is of critical importance. And that strategy specifically is what really leads me to believe, and why I think they believe that tariffs will be coming into place, and tariffs will be coming into place in a stronger way. So this is not just talk and bluster. This administration does seem to have a very clear strategy that they're executing and building towards. It's not clear to all of us, but part of that needs to be that it can't be clear to the rest of the world. The United States interest it's in the United States interest, and it is our interest to rebuild industrialization within our borders. And that is exactly what these tariffs and all of the other steps we're seeing right now are designed to do.
And some of the data that Trump has referenced in talks has been a wide gap between the US and Europe about the trade deficit. Now, some of our colleagues in Europe were showing us coverage and pushback about how the EU actually runs a services deficit with the United States as trading partners, but there's still a pretty substantial net balance of trade in favor of the EU. They do export more to the US.
And Justin, I think some of that services disparity has to do with where intellectual property has been parked. There were massive tax advantages for many years to do things like a double Dutch Irish, which Apple did, where they effectively got their tax rate down to zero. Now that got corrected, and Ireland ended up collecting a significant amount of revenue because of that from Apple, and Microsoft and others are now paying real taxes to Ireland. But we're seeing that shift of intellectual property offshore has resulted in this swing in trade. It's not necessarily, and I think the administration would argue it's not a real swing. It's just it was a tax optimization strategy. But I think that's something we could discuss at length on another webinar.
Yeah, and I wasn't going to show this, but I might just pull up a look at just EU trade. So this is from the perspective of the EU. The data here, we pulled it from Eurostat, and you can see that they are exporting much more than they are importing in terms of goods. It's the similar gap that you saw reported on the previous slide, but it's been pretty consistent. When I pulled the 2014 and compared it to 2024, you could see the ratio has stayed pretty similar, but because of the growth in absolute terms, that leads to the, as Trump would say, billions and billions of dollars of trade deficit that he's looking at in terms of goods, and he wants to see more manufactured goods. That's a stated. More people buy American manufactured goods, whether it's Americans or abroad. Now, when we're also thinking about these reciprocal tariffs, we just pulled some data looking at who has some of the highest tariff levels, even though we discussed that there will be other non-tariff barriers that will be considered as part of this plan. But mostly developing economies have the biggest gaps here, as well as China. Depends if you consider them a developing economy or not. It feels a little weird to call the largest global exporter and manufacturer a developing economy, but they're often still in that bucket.
Well, that's where they want to be, Justin. And I think that's the realization that's happening in the education that's happening right now. They are the manufacturing engine for the world. So they're going to lose that ability, and they should not have. If we truly had globalization, their tariff rates would be zero, because they would be very keen to have an open market, just like the US was when we exited World War II and really brought things down close to zero so that we could more easily trade with everyone in the world. For me, India also is a real outlier here. The level of tariffs that India has, I think there's going to be a lot of pressure, and there was the meeting that President Trump had at the White House talking about that. I think we're going to see a lot more pressure placed on India, and they will rise to the top in these harmonized tariff discussions.
It is interesting because when I think back to one of our industry surveys, our latest automotive executive industry survey that we shared in our January auto report, India was the top location by far that those procurement and supply chain leaders were looking at as a location. So we'll have to see how that shakes out. But they would be set to lose some advantages here if the plan announced April 1st matches the data we're looking at here.
Mm-hmm.
And we also just took a look at some of the earnings calls and different investor days just to see what executives were saying publicly about tariffs. Now, this is often to the financial analyst crowd. So, or in Jim Farley's case, this was to reporters. And this was before Trump announced that he was considering a 25% tariff on autos. Maybe that 25% tariff on autos was in reaction to Jim's comment here, because it's that harmonization that Ambrose was talking about. Because Ford has a decent chunk of manufacturing in Mexico, a little bit less than some other brands, but Farley was concerned that if a tariff does go out on March 4th on Mexico, then importers from Korea and Japan, who have fewer restrictions, he's not going to be concerned about China because they have 100% tariff on EVs, but uh, there will need to be a balancing. And so that's following those comments from Jim. I don't know if it prompted it, but that is when Trump said, well, we'll do a 25% tariff on autos imported. And he said he was thinking about April 2nd, but that's not an official executive order. That's just his comments. But I've been surprised about the translation almost directly of Trump's comments that people maybe thought would be bluster and actually turning into almost verbatim into executive orders. That's been much higher this time than
And
2016.
well, Justin, we're no longer seeing the midnight tweets. We're now seeing things come out during the day, aligned to press conferences, aligned to announcements from the Oval Office or on Air Force One. There is a clear and consistent messaging stream. There is a strategy for reindustrialization, and companies like Ford, Nissan, Stellantis, uh, General Motors are all feeling a lot of pressure to pull manufacturing back into the United States. They are or were American companies. Stellantis is a European company right now, but we'll still think of them as an American company, part of the big three. And them pulling the manufacturing out of wherever it is and bringing it back in the United States to sell in the United States market makes sense. We've talked a lot in the past for years about manufacturing in the country, in the region where you want to sell. I think we've moved away from just being in the region. We can't just chase lowest cost labor. We need to be focusing on where we're going to sell and making in that end market. And there are companies that do a fabulous job of that, others that struggle. But pricing, it looks at pricing power. So automakers, I think, have pushed prices as high as they can go. I think other industries have the ability or the capability to exercise some of that pricing muscle and raise prices to consumers. Consumers are tapped out with cars. It's the second largest purchase most people make. So with that, we're at a breaking point for a lot of people. We need to figure out how do we do it so that people can still afford the cars that they need, because the age of vehicles, as we talk about in our automotive report, has gone up. For other things, for pharmaceuticals, for furniture, for durable goods, there's more ability to raise prices a bit. So we're just going to wait. We'll see what happens, and we'll see what prices get passed on and what don't. When we looked at this early on, Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley were both talking about less than 1% impact on inflation. So we'll see what happens here. I believe the administration sees value in reindustrializing the United States, and they're willing to accept, as they've said, some short-term pain for that gain. So we'll have to watch.
Yeah, and one thing to call out here is, as we're waiting and seeing, there are companies taking action. So, for instance, even on this list, uh, Ingersoll Rand was discussing uh, moving production lines, some of the ones that they can, and mitigating the rest through pricing adjustments. Phillips was saying that they've been moving towards a more regional strategy and will continue to execute on that. So those are real actions that people are taking because they're seeing the um, tea leaves, or however you want to say that. But there is clear messaging, and for a number of reasons, people were talking about regionalization post COVID as well. So those are actions companies are doing, and I think if you're looking at will you be able to pass on pricing, I think there's some level of looking at historical data. For instance, Ambrose mentioned the auto industry. We can look that prices basically increased from 2021 to 2023, but in 2024 were flat as sales were not really able to. They started going down substantially when they were hitting a ceiling. So that's one thing you can look at. And then also, really with the automotive industry, this is super pronounced. And what I was talking about with Jim Farley is what's your competitor's footprint like? Are
Mhm.
you competing against all made in USA products and your main market is the USA? That might be quite challenging if as tariffs roll out. But if you're Acer here and you're competing against mostly people that are importing from China and they have nearly identical supply chain footprints to you, it's probably fine to be able to pass along those price increases. So it's just something to think about with your teams. And I just want to remind anybody, if we do have any questions, I think we're just going to move on to our last slide we're going to show today. So if you have questions, we'll take them, but we're going to keep it mostly short today.
So we've talked at length about what you can do. The key thing that I'm continually talking to people. The key thing that I'm hearing right now is people struggling to figure out how do they deal with their tier 2, 3, 4 tier N suppliers, and understanding where those products are coming from. There was a statement that was covered in Bloomberg. There is talk here in DC, if the China negotiations don't go well, of really putting a squeeze on. And the most effective way to do that is to put a tariff not just on goods coming out of China, but to put that same tariff on anything that contains a Chinese-made component. And there's so many products out there that contain a resistor or a capacitor, something that is really only made in China right now. So we need to take a very clear look. We need to have very open eyes to understand what would the impact of that be. I think we've learned that these are what we thought were extremely unlikely but high impact events are actually probable at this point in time. And the high impact probable events need to be taken into account, and we need to develop contingency plans. So I'm hoping that no one here has their head in the sand. If you haven't already started to prepare for tariffs, please reach out. Let's have a conversation, whether we help you or just give you some guidance. We want everyone to be preparing for these tariffs, to be ready for these tariffs. There's a lot that can be done. You should have a war room set up. You should have mapped out your supply chain. You should understand the harmonized tariff codes for everything that you're buying right now. And you should be moving down to a tier N level, talking to your suppliers, making sure you understand where their supply is coming from and where the components in their supply originates. We want to know that, and we want to be ready. So we appreciate everyone's time. Justin, do we have any questions?
It doesn't look like we have any questions today, so I think we can
Wonderful.
wrap up, and we will
So
continue to do these.
we'll continue to do these. Please follow me, follow Seraph. Let us know what's helpful. Reach out if you do have questions moving forward. We're happy to continue to have these discussions, and we'll schedule another update as more news comes out. We greatly appreciate it. We've also added on our website, as you can see down below, the Seraph Tariff Tracker. We're trying to keep live updates of what's going on. We're trying to post things as soon as they come out in the media so that everyone has a single source to go to. We found that this was helpful during COVID as things started to shut down. We found that as crises emerge, this helps. Lots going to change. It's going to be a very dynamic environment. Tariffs will go on, tariffs will go off over the course of this administration. And as we reindustrialize the United States, we need to understand what that does across Europe and across the Americas and across Asia. Look forward to speaking